Okay, here we go. So West Between Wars, what I call an era of disillusionment in class. And really what we try to do is talk about how there was so much hope after the Great War that things could be better. And we quickly find out that things aren't getting better. That the, for lack of a better term, sins of World War I are going to plague Europe, the Middle East, and the Asian countries of China, Japan, of course many others, but those will be our focus. And so what I try to teach the 1920s and even the 1930s is this idea that there was so much hope across countries, across the world really, but there was a huge letdown. And that letdown I have called West Between Wars. And so we'll try to talk about what's going on in the 20s and 30s in Europe. We'll talk about what happens in India to a lesser extent, but certainly the Middle East. And then we'll finish up by talking about Asia and really try to give you a really good idea of why Pearl Harbor began and really get us ready for World War II. So stay with me. I'll do my best. I got a lot to talk about, so here we go. First, World War I, you have Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson had good intentions. By all accounts, his 14 points, he had this concept called self-determination, which said that nations should have the right to form their own nationhood, and people should be able to come together across ethnic lines and form their own countries. So self-determination is one of his parts of his 14 points address. Also, he talked about the League of Nations. He believed that if all countries were under one banner, under one sort of alliance system, right, if everyone was on the same team, there would be no need for war. However, as you know, the U.S. did not decide to join. And so that weakens a league because the United States, coming out of World War I, is one of the, if not the strongest nation in the world. I mean, it's just a powerhouse. They were owed a lot of money from the Allies, and so they're not only just financially in a good position, the Roaring Twenties is happening in the United States, but militarily speaking, they're a powerhouse as well. And so without them, the League of Nations isn't as strong as it probably could have been. Many nations are sort of scared that you're going to trust another nation with your own security. I'd rather trust my own military. And so the League of Nations, it's a failure. Now, here's another example where there were really good intentions. They were trying for something positive with the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1926. And the idea was, we are going to outlaw war. We are going to make war not a tool that nations are allowed to use. And while that sounds really nice, it sounds really lofty and cuddly even, there was no sanctions against you. If you did go to war, we didn't really talk about what happens to you. What happens to you as a nation? What happens to you economically? There were no penalties for this. And so it has nothing to do with cereal. It has everything to do with trying to outlaw war. Of course, not having a penalty is the failure there. The Weimar Republic, and that's how we pronounce it, right? The Weimar Republic is what we call Germany after World War I. Before the Nazi flag rises up, you have the Weimar Republic. It's a shot at democracy. It's a chance that the German people are going to have a democratic regime. They are not going to be led by a Kaiser, but instead they're going to be led by a prime minister, and they're going to try to model something akin to what Great Britain runs. It was a good idea, again, but the Weimar Republic had a lot of weaknesses to it. The big weakness is that the Treaty of Versailles made it almost impossible for them to do business because the reparations were so high. Now remember what a reparation is. It's money that you're paying because you, and I'm using air quotes here, started a war, okay, or because you lost. So the reparation money that Germany had to pay for World War I crippled them economically. And they could not get out from underneath this. And I'll talk a little bit about what's the result of these reparations. But it clearly weakens the government. It makes people not like the government. It makes people not even trust the government. It leads to what we call inflation. So when prices get out of control, like they were in Germany, what the government tried to do, at least when they were trying to pay these reparations, because they had to pay them, is they decided they were going to print more money. And when you do that, when you print more money, you lose value in your own currency. Your own currency doesn't mean much. And the example I use is if everyone in the classroom is a millionaire, well then being a millionaire isn't all that impressive anymore, right? Because everybody's got the money. And what we see is that if there is so much money in the economy, then all that does is everything sort of makes all prices go up. And so inflation is caused. And Germany is at the center of a worldwide depression. It's not just Germany that's dealing with this. Repairing World War I is a problem. It is a lot to fix all in one shot. And so the world is in severe depression and millions are unemployed. Particularly in Germany is where we see it hit the worst. And so what you'd see is children like playing with money to go buy a loaf of bread over there on the right. You've got a wheelbarrow. How sad that must be. So I found this slide. It basically talks about hyperinflation. That's what we see in Germany. So in November of 1918, buy a loaf of bread for $1. Sounds very reasonable. But by November of 1923, I mean, it's just astronomical. You're having to, again, take that wheelbarrow with marks to bring it to your local grocery store to get one loaf of bread. A lot of what started to happen was people would just start trading or doing like a barter economy because the money was just worthless. You have a communist sort of undertone that starts to develop in Germany, which was worrisome. And what we'll talk about in World War II, is that eventually those communist sort of underpinnings in Germany are going to give rise to Adolf Hitler. He's going to use the communists as a way to take power. He's going to use them against themselves in a way. But story for another day. The Great Depression. Why did we have one? What's sort of the overall reasons? Of course, the stock market crash in 1929, I guess, is the biggest reason in America, but that does affect the worldwide markets because money was tied everywhere. It's not quite as bad as it is today with globalism, but certainly money was tied, and there was a less of a demand for raw materials. I mean, you just didn't need as much. We had overproduced a lot. We had produced a lot of goods, and there wasn't enough to go around. Another thing that's really not smart to do is people were buying stocks on credit. You can't do that. When you buy something like a stock on credit, when the stocks go down, it's not really your money. You've spent somebody else's money, right? That's what credit is. And so it causes big problems, and it's going to lead to a Great Depression. So you got businesses closing, you've got unemployment rates astronomical, you've got tariffs are getting high, everyone's trying to worry about themselves. There is this concern that maybe democracy isn't the best way to do business. Maybe capitalism is a failure. Maybe Adam Smith and laissez-faire, they don't know what they're talking about. Economists like John Maynard Keynes will talk about, say, this whole idea of laissez-faire, it doesn't work. We need to step in. We need to do something about it. And some people are saying maybe we need a command economy like what they've got over in the USSR. Maybe we need a strong leader that can take us out. And they're looking for someone to promise them that their families are going to eat and that things are going to get better. And they're going to get it in the worst way with these fascist dictators, like an Adolf Hitler, like a Benito Mussolini. They're going to rely on these people. And it's going to get really, really bad very quickly. So, important person that I want you to know. I don't ask for you to know too many economists. You know, I don't really consider Karl Marx an economist, but you should know him. You should know Adam Smith as laissez-faire and the concept of the invisible hand. But John Maynard Keynes is a guy I do want you to know. Because Keynes' philosophy is, his overarching idea was that during Depression, the governments, the national government needs to step in and protect the people. It needs to do something. Basically, he's saying laissez-faire is not enough, that countries need to spend money to get people working again. We need to spend money to give people food, basic needs, basic shelter, that governments need to take a role in helping the people during depression. They cannot just let them stay down. Otherwise, you get what we call revolution, or in this case, we're going to get a fascist sort of regime that comes out of these ashes. also during this time period, during the 1920s, we're getting a rise in what we call women's suffrage. Now we say it has nothing to do with suffering. Suffrage is a good thing. It is the ability for women to vote. And a lot of that comes out of this spirit that women really stepped up during World War I. They took the factory jobs. They took a leadership role when the men were away. And so the women sort of showed, and they'd been showing this, but certainly really proved that they were every bit as powerful and witty and willing to sacrifice as any man was, and that they deserved, and needed to get the right to vote quickly and now. And so finally, enough is enough. Stop pushing down the women's right to vote. That now in the United States and then across the world later, we're going to see women's suffrage expand. And there's a lot to say about that. I mean, in the United States, different states had allowed women the right to vote before 1920, but the 19th Amendment allows women the right to vote in the United States. But across the world, we're seeing women's voices amplified. So, on the one hand, there's some good things in this chapter that I really like, but on the other hand, there's a lot of suffering that goes along with the 1920s and the 30s. Okay, now, that's sort of where we are in Europe. Transitioning to the Middle East. Because remember, this is a global class. We got a lot to cover here. There is nationalism being amplified after World War I. It's getting just tangible. And we're seeing that in Iran, there's a nationalist movement led by Reza Khan, who is going to overthrow the leader of Iran, what we would call the Shah. And Reza Khan is going to do a couple of things. Going to modernize, going to industrialize. Reminds you of a Peter the Great, right? He's going to take his country from the Stone Ages and he's going to bring it up to what the West is. He is going to try to get his military ready. He's going to try to build factories. So modernize, industrialize, you could call it westernization if you want to. The goal is to sort of catch up and bring his country back to strength. There is a broader movement outside of Iran that maybe the Arab countries need to unite. That maybe the Arab countries, if they unite together, they can be a powerful empire. Maybe more powerful than the Ottoman Empire ever could be. And so we call this movement Pan-Arabism. The idea that the Arab people are going to come together, they're going to form a nation. It is an ethnic movement. It is a nationalist movement that is being echoed throughout the 20s and 30s as well. This one's something that trips up students a lot, and I think it's because we just need to go over it a couple of different times. But Zionism is a movement that the Regents loves to ask about. And basically what it is, Zionism is a commitment by leaders to give the Jewish people a homeland. And particularly where we're looking for that homeland is going to be Israel. That the British are going to actually promise the Jewish people a state in what we would call Palestine. And it gets complex, and I'm not here to do the whole Israeli-Palestine conflict right now. That's too much. But really what you need to know is that the Jewish people were looking for a homeland. These people have been persecuted throughout history, and the British said, you can have a homeland. We'll call it Israel. It's in the state that's known as Palestine today, where a lot of Arab people are. But they also promised it to the Arabs. And so they promised one place. The Arabs called it Palestine. The Jewish people called it Israel. They promised one piece of land to two different groups of people. Replay that back. They promised one piece of land to two different groups of people. What could happen, right? It is a horrible idea. It is completely irresponsible, and it's going to blow up. Quite literally. But it's going to tear apart families. It's going to tear apart the Middle East. It is still a problem to this very day. Okay? So it starts in the 20s. And again, that's why this chapter is just so important. It's the bridge to everything. Gandhi deserves his own lecture. So I'm not here to really talk too much about peaceful protests and Salt March and all that kind of stuff. Basically, what I want you to know is that Gandhi is starting his movement. He's working through Indian nationalism. He's trying to bring his people together through peaceful means, through nonviolent protest. He is going to use civil disobedience. And Gandhi is starting this in the 20s. He's starting it in the 30s. So when we talk about India becoming separate and independent from the British, I just want you to know Gandhi didn't do it like overnight or something like that. He'd been working on it for years, and it took persistence. It took a lot of hard work for him to get to where he was as this great, great leader that we remember him as. Okay. Now we've also got to talk about Turkey when we talk about the Middle East. And Turkey is going to be unified under a guy named Kemal Ataturk. Say that aloud, Kemal Ataturk. Considered the father of the Turkish people. He is going to kick out any Western powers that are trying to colonize the Middle East or take any control. And he is going to do the same thing that Reza Khan did. Modernize and industrialize. Make this country get more powerful. Factories. Military. It's going to bring it up to a state that they can be proud of. This is certainly a nationalist movement, but again, reminds you the same things that Peter the Great was doing way back, modernizing and westernizing. Same idea, right? So you've got over there, you've got Kemal Ataturk on the left and Reza Khan on the right. And basically what they want you to be able to do is take these leaders, put them together, and say that choice one, they both wanted to westernize their nation. That's the idea. They want westernization. Regents loves to ask that. Now, it's not all good in Turkey. And one of the things that I talk to my students about is the Armenian genocide. Again, I can't do it justice in this lecture, but what the Turkish people, the young Turks, did to the Christian Armenian people is horrific. They marched them into deserts. They forced them out of their homelands. They killed them in mass graves. This was genocide. And it's going to lead to 1 million deaths of Romanian Christians. And we still don't call it a genocide to this day. The United States doesn't recognize it because Turkey is our ally, and we're unwilling to go that far. But it happened. And I think that human rights violations like these, they continue to happen. And I think a lot of it has to do with we suppress these things. They're so gory that we don't want to talk about them. However, their deaths cannot just be forgotten. And here's why we shouldn't. You got a quote here. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? What a quote, right? Like, who really cares about the Armenians? Nobody talks about them anymore. So who said that? Are you thinking like somebody present day, or it's Adolf Hitler? Adolf Hitler said that, right? He was emboldened by this, what the Turkish people were able to do, what the young Turks were able to do to the Armenians. And he said, well, if they can do that to these Christian people, why can't I exterminate the Jewish people? And that is why these historical events matter. They build on one another, and in this way, a horrific build to this awful, awful mass execution that will occur in World War II. I show my students a clip from this documentary called Screamers that has to do with System of a Down, Serge Tankin, and he really tries to take a lead on the Armenian genocide and talk about how it did happen and how we need to do something about it, right? And it's a really good documentary. Check it out. I think it's worth your time. But in the spirit of all the things we got to talk about, we're going to keep moving, and we're going to keep moving to Italy. And Italy, during the 1920s and 30s, is suffering just as Germany's suffering. There's war veterans that come back, don't have jobs. You've got trade very, very slow. High taxes, striking workers, and people are looking for answers. And they're going to look for somebody that's strong, who can promise that Italy can be a great country again. And Benito Mussolini is going to do that. he is going to have a leadership role in the fascist government. And basically what he's saying is, you can be, if you support me, I can make us strong like the Roman Empire. And for many people, the Roman Empire, I mean, they're like, are you serious? That could be us? And he's using history to his advantage. And he creates what we call a fascist government. Basically, the idea of a fascist government is, what I tell my students is, it's nationalism on steroids. And what I mean by that is, under a fascist government, the individual no longer is important. The only thing that is important is the state. What can I do for my state, for my nation, right? And the more I can give to my nation, the better. But if I can't, well then, I'm not very important anymore. So a fascist government requires that you're obedient, and you're obedient to your state. And in this case, the state is run by a dictator. Mussolini is going to fulfill that role. Adolf Hitler will fulfill that role. And I know there's a big historical debate about, is Adolf Hitler fascist, or is everyone says Mussolini's fascist, but certainly there's a debate there. I consider him to be a fascist. I think that he is in many, many ways. But another lecture, I guess. Now, to take power, he is going to give the youth a voice, and war veterans, but he's going to give the youth a voice, and he's going to do it by making them a part of a march on Rome. He has a group called the Black Shirts, which is what the youth could join, and the Black Shirts are going to take Rome. They are going to say, King Victor Emmanuel III, by the way, your power's gone, get out of here. And the title is El Duce. That is the title that Benito Mussolini is going to take. He is going to be the one in charge. And to keep power, well, he's got his black shirts underneath him. And they're used to using force, but also these really awful, terrible ways of instilling fear. One was through castor oil, which creates extreme diarrhea. But second was toads. They feed you toads to inspire fear. And that, I don't know about you, but just thinking about that kind of scares me a little. He's going to end free elections. He's going to go after free speech, freedom of press. He's going to do everything he can to totally control politics and make it all about himself. And when he can do that, when he can control the politics, well then he needs to control the people. So to do that, he will kill, he will jail any enemies that speak out, but he will also use propaganda. That he sends out messages, posters like this, to build himself up while simultaneously tearing everybody else down. That includes the communists that were within Italy. He really attacks them hard and makes sure that those communists are labeled as enemies, not only killed and jailed, but certainly he goes after them in every way that he can. And one of the things that he does that's very smart to not only appeal to the younger folk, right? He's done that through his black shirts and given them police power and things, but to make sure that the old guard supports him, he keeps the traditional structure of the Catholic Church in power. And that sort of appeases everyone. It gives something to everybody, because now the Catholic Church can continue to run and collect taxes and do all the things that it normally does. Then he does a big move to try to show the people why they should follow him. You see, way back when, in the scramble for Africa, Italy had failed to take over Ethiopia. They failed, and everybody laughed at them and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe you couldn't take over little tiny Ethiopia. And Benito Mussolini said, under my rule, under my power, nobody's going to laugh at you. Nobody will ever laugh at you. And he goes out and he takes Ethiopia. And I always say that when he did that, it's like beating up on a fourth grader. It's like, Ethiopia was not a powerful nation by any stretch, and not really modernized and industrialized. And what Mussolini does, though, is he uses history again to sort of empower himself. And once they are able to take over Ethiopia, he gains popularity. It's like, oh my gosh, we did it. Under Mussolini, maybe we can do anything. Maybe we can be that empire that we used to be when we were Rome. So he's brilliant in that way of manipulation. And I think that's one of the things that these dictators do well is they manipulate the masses very well. He will become Adolf Hitler's ally in World War II and ride his coattails. But ultimately, what I want you to know is that Mussolini is a coward. When the chips are down, when the Allies are coming through after defeating Adolf Hitler's general at El Alamein and moving through, Rommel's done, and they beat up the forces in North Africa, and the Allies are coming for him, he tries to run. He tries to run, and his own people are going to take him out. So, again, story for another day, but for me, nothing more than a coward. So there's Italy. When I talk about fascism, I really have this conversation about there are many aspects of fascism. Strong military, you censor the press so that certain messages are only coming out. You control big business, right? You have a dictator, your terror and violence, all these things. And I ask my students, what are the top three in fascism? And often what I get is strong military, number one. The second thing I get is a lot of use of terror and violence to keep the people in line. And then last but not least, I think that a lot of students talk about the role of propaganda and how that sort of preserves and keeps people following the dictator. And so we have a nice discussion about it. But those are the sort of the aspects of fascism. Last but not least, in Spain, we have an authoritarian state. Now, authoritarianism is very much like absolutism. You're just not worshiping a king in this sense. Really what you've got is another dictator, in this case a general. And so the authoritarian regime is led by Francisco Franco. And the Spanish Civil War is a complicated one. It took me a really long time to understand it in college and reading books from George Orwell and stuff. And it took me a really long time, but the idea, for our purposes in class, what we really need to know about the Spanish Civil War and the authoritarian regime was that there were a lot of foreign governments in Spain trying to help the rebels, trying to help Franco, but ultimately one man really stands out to me, and that's Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler uses this as an opportunity. The Spanish Civil War becomes a way for him to test out all of the weapons he is going to use in World War II. The strategies of the Blitzkrieg. He uses the Spanish Civil War as a sandbox to do that, to test out and say, okay, is my military up to speed? Let's get all the kinks out now before I really try to take over things. And so Adolf Hitler is going to help, Benito Mussolini to a lesser extent, but now you're sort of just seeing how this stuff is coming together. And in the end, Franco is going to win. He's going to capture Madrid. The coalition of forces under the Spanish Civil War, groups like POUM, groups that are anarchist or groups that are communist, they're all going to be defeated. And it's going to be General Franco that keeps the Catholic state alive and is going to eventually really solidify power in Spain. Okay. Now that we've got sort of all of Europe put away, the last thing that we really want to talk about is Asia. And to do that, we'll start with China and we'll overlap them with Japan. Things get complicated. There's a lot of names. Probably a part of the lecture you might want to listen to maybe twice. But here we go. The Qing dynasty is the dynasty that I've left you with. This is the last dynasty that we've really talked about. We talk about a lot of dynasties in Global 9, but in Global 10, we really have only talked about one, which is the Qing dynasty. It was losing a lot of power for two reasons, really. The first is that they are fighting the Opium Wars. And that's the story with Lin Zexu and Queen Victoria and how she's sending in the Nemesis ship to take over. Ultimately, they are going to have to sign the Treaty of Nanking, be carved into spheres of influence. America's going to come in with their open door policy and really, really destabilize the place, open it up to foreigners. You got the Boxer Rebellion, where people try to rise up against the foreigners but ultimately are crushed. And this is an instance where the Qing dynasty is really, really struggling. The Treaty of Nanking makes them pay for the Opium Wars. I mean, it's bad. To compound that, they also had the Taiping Rebellion, where this was an internal civil war between Hong Xiaoshuan, who was believed to be like the brother of Jesus, and all this sort of crazy stuff. But the point is that the Taiping Rebellion is sort of like a civil war that ravages the countryside, particularly in the West. And then you've got the Opium Wars, which really devastate and make China become kind of like a semi-colony in a way. really carved up. The Canton system is no more. It's broken down. And here's where things just like collapse. You see, you've got a 2-year-old emperor, the last emperor really, Puyi, is going to take the throne. And that's at 2 years old. Now, he's got advisors and things, and I understand that, but I think China, at this point, if they were going to stay a dynasty, they needed a strong emperor. And at 2 years old, Puyi was just not ever going to be up for the task. No 2-year-old would have been. So Puyi becomes the last emperor, and China actually has its own revolution. They go through this movement called self-strengthening, where they're really trying to increase their own power and get foreign influence out. And ultimately, this sort of comes to a headway when a nationalist-inspired movement to have a revolution is going to occur. And by 1911, the Qing dynasty, it's finally out. The people are going to try their hands at a republic, kind of like the West. It reminds you of, they're trying to westernize, they're trying to industrialize, right? Just like Reza Khan was, just like Kemal Ataturk was. Maybe we're going to see it in China, though it wasn't meant to be, I guess. They lean on a really smart guy. His name is Sun Yat-sen. And Sun Yat-sen was going to be president. He was good in his studies, he was a good speaker, he was definitely all there as part of, his intellect. But he wasn't a military guy, so just keep that in the back of your mind. And Sun Yat-sen is going to be president. Sun Yat-sen is going to run on an easy platform, kind of like Vladimir Lenin did with Peace, Bread, and Land. He had 3 principles that every person could really understand. The first was nationalism. We're nationalist. We are going to kick out these foreigners. This is China for the Chinese. Second, he says, I'm going to give you democracy. I'm going to give you a representative government. Not a direct democracy, right? This isn't ancient Athens, but we're going to give you something where you can vote for people. You can have a voice in the Chinese government. This isn't, there's an emperor and the emperor decides everything. The common person can have a voice in Chinese government. And so that appeals to the people. And last but not least, and he really understands this, just like Lenin had bread as part of his slogan, Sun Yat-sen is going to have livelihood, is his. He says, I'm going to find a way to get the people working again. I'm going to find a way to get a good livelihood for the people, to get a good career. Like, for example, my career, I'm a teacher. That's my livelihood, right? He's trying to give people in China their livelihood, their job, their career. And he's promising that. He's saying, I'm going to pick up this economy. We are going to be a strong nation again. And so Sun Yat-sen's got this great idea. He thinks it's going to work. He creates the Nationalist Party, what we will call the Kuomintang. And I know that's a big word. It's pronounced Kuomintang. And you'll see it sometimes spelled differently. Don't worry about that. Just know that it's the Kuomintang is a nationalist group. It's Sun Yat-sen's group. And basically what he's trying to do with the nationalists is he says, okay, I need an army so that I can unify China. There were some warlords in China. I know that sounds really, really far off and old, like Global 9 stuff, but it's true. He has to really defeat some of these warlords that are way out in the rural areas of China and spread his democracy. And he's asking for help from the West, but remember, the West is in a big depression. So that's not easy for them to give him aid, and they're not willing to do that. They're not willing to help Sun Yat-sen. However, the Soviet Union is willing to help the peasants. They're not willing to help Sun Yat-sen, but they are willing to help the peasants, and so there becomes a growing communist movement in China. So just to recap, you've got this nationalist movement. They're trying to get more powerful. You've got Sun Yat-sen, a nationalist. But he hasn't unified the country yet. And so there's this growing communist movement. And what you start to see is the seeds of civil war, where there is a communist group, later called the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. And then on the other side, you've got the Nationalist Party, known as the Kuomintang. And Sun Yat-sen ultimately has to find a way to, unify the country. And he knows he can't do it on his own. And so he turns to a man by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, not Shrek. Okay? Chiang Kai-shek, not Shrek. And he is going to take over in 1925. I believe Sun Yat-sen runs away to try to get to America and tries to flee. He has nothing to do with this. It's out of control. And Chiang Kai-shek was less of a NDL, nationalism, democracy, livelihood, and much more of a, let me conquer this group and let me take over China. And then if that democracy stuff works out, great, but I'm a military man, right? I'm looking for order. I'm looking for structure, and I'm looking for a unified China. Whatever I've got to do that, but this is war. And Chiang Kai-shek does something awful. In 27, 2 years after he's in power, he orders a massacre of the communists. He believes that they're threats, and so he's going out and he's killing communists. And for the communist people, the party, the movement that will be eventually picked up by Mao Zedong, who's a teacher and will really, really take a hold of this movement. They're like, we can't trust the nationalists. And so you see this like splintering in China, where the nationalists and the communists, they don't like one another. They hate one another. And while I'm not going to give you the end of the Civil War, because there's a lot there that I haven't talked about, Great Leap Forward and the Long March and stuff, but somebody's looking out and they're saying, oh my gosh, China's weak. They're a weaker nation. And we are a stronger nation. I mean, heck, we almost beat Russia in 1905. If you know what I'm talking about, then you're a really good global student, because you're right, Japan is the one. And Japan is looking out and they're saying, we can take them. For our economic gain, for our military gain, we can take them. We can use imperialism. We can use the thing that Commodore Matthew Perry in America taught us way, way back when we signed the Treaty of Kanagawa and went through the Meiji Restoration and saw what guns, what trains, and what telegraph lines could do. Let's test this thing out. And so they begin to try to take over China. And so Japan, we talked about how they had, after the Russo-Japanese War, began recruiting soldiers. But we call them the Isengoren, the postmark soldiers. You would get a postmark and you were told that your 5-year-old is going to go off to learn to fight, to become a soldier, to serve the emperor. And people were like excited, like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to send my 5-year-old. I mean, this is serve the emperor. This is great. And so Japan creates this like really militaristic society, a dangerously militaristic society. And they're going to unleash that Isengoren child soldier grown up, finally, massive group of soldiers. And they're real, I guess the way that I try to explain it is they ruin these kids. They make them into these robotic killing machines. They aren't supposed to feel pain or suffering or empathy for others. And they preach this and indoctrinate these kids. And when they grow up, they're going to go over to China. And here's what they're looking for. So they've got this powerful military. They want an empire across Southeast Asia, but even into Asia, the continent. And they know in the back of their mind, they got one nation that they got to worry about. It's the United States. But otherwise, they can do this. If they can take out Russia and beat them and really, they graded themselves like a C. They're like, we did good, not great. But now that they've got this new improved military, there's one country that could possibly stop them. It's America. Otherwise, they can do whatever they want. And so they're going to take the lessons of Commodore Matthew Perry and they're going to use them. At least that's from their perspective. And so Japan first goes in and takes over what we would consider northern China, Manchuria. And they kind of realize, like, nothing happens. Like, they're able to take the resources that they're looking for. They're looking for iron. They're looking for oil. They're looking for iron to build their ships and their fleet and get their factories running. And they're looking for oil to make sure that they have gasoline for all of their many airplanes to run off of and to make sure that their cars are running. And so they're looking for iron, looking for oil, and the place that they end up going to after Manchuria is going to be Nanjing, or the newer spelling, Nanking. And what they do, something fierce. They have a sword contest where two men would get together and they would try to see how many heads they could chop off, who could do it the fastest. Just awful games. And what they would do is they would make the Chinese people take pictures of this bloodbath that they were engaging in. And eventually, some of those Chinese people decided to take duplicates. And they hid them away, and one day a woman's going to come get them. More on that in a second. Here's the Shanghai rail station bombing. We call it Bloody Saturday. Okay, awful pictures, and Americans are going to pick up the newspaper, and they're eventually going to see photos like that. They're going to see the dehumanization. What I teach is to treat each other as less than human, but there's two components, both physically and emotionally, right? And Iris Chang, the woman that sort of alluded to earlier, is going to take over and go to China, and her idea, her thesis really in college, was to figure out what happened in 1937. Because nobody would talk about it. It was really weird. She would go ask her grandparents, and they wouldn't talk about why they came to America. This was this big thing, and ultimately Iris Chang figured out what had happened. She found a man that was willing to give her the duplicates of what the Japanese had made him take pictures of. And she found some things that really disgusted her. And if there's anything you do, I love to have my students read, but don't read this book. This is awful. Awful. In fact, Iris Chang is eventually going to commit suicide after writing this book. Some evil things that go on. Evil things that make you question humanity. So, there's a film strip in the Rusty Box. There's statues of Iris Chang in Nanjing. And Japan now is deciding to make itself an empire. Now, when America finds out about what Japan is doing, they're like, Japan, what? What do you need to stop. Get out of China. You have no right. And Japan says, we're just doing what you taught us, what Commodore Matthew taught us. I mean, we're just doing what the blueprint of imperialism is, right? We're a stronger nation. They're a weaker one. We come in. We take it over. Isn't that what you taught us? And America's like, you went too far. This is too far. Get out. And they're like, well, we're looking for iron and we're looking for oil and we're going to take it. It's ours. It's our right. And America says enough. So you're not going to take it. We're going to put up a embargo. You're not getting any iron. You're not getting any oil. We're not trading with you. That's it. Until you fix this, we're not. And Japan says, you hypocrites. You hypocrites, right? For you to talk to us about imperialism, right? You who's got this wonderful station of Pearl Harbor, you who have taken over the Philippines and done awful things there, you who have spread into Guam and made Cuba some sort of semi-colony, how can you call us out, right? And Japan says, you know what? Okay. We hear you loud and clear. And Japan starts to formulate a plot. They said, we can not prevent America from coming at us, but we can slow them down. How do we do it? They want to embargo us. That's going to need ships. Ships are going to be needed, right? They have to sail them over. Destroy the ships. The embargo is going to take 5 years to put together. They take 5 years for them to rebuild, right? Knock them out. We hit them first before they ever get a chance to hit us. Meanwhile, once we hit them, we get underneath these islands. We dig holes, quite literally, by the way, a series of tunnels and things. And we hold out and we wait. And we fight island by island. It'll happen in World War II. So, I mean to tell you this because I want you to see the longer thread of history. That Pearl Harbor does not just happen. This is a series of events that has led to Pearl Harbor. This is a long-standing historical series of events. And so I hope you don't forget it. I hope this has sort of made a little bit more sense as to why Pearl Harbor happened. Last kind of couple bits about Japanese invasion. You should know that they started in Manchuria, which is way, way north. It's like north of Korea. They push down into the mainland. They take over Nanjing. They commit awful atrocities. Now, to bring it back to the Chinese Civil War, the nationalists actually have to beg the communists, like, please, we're losing our people. The Japanese are, they're monsters. Help us. And the communists have to come in and unite with the nationalists. And they do. They just tell the nationalists that once we kick out Japan, you nationalists who couldn't defeat Japan, you're out. You're gone. And they will. They're going to leave to Taiwan. But again, story for another day. So the Isengoran come in, they rape, they kill, they destroy, the things that I'm not comfortable talking about, to be honest with you. And by 1941, Pearl Harbor is going to be the place that is hit, December 7th, a day that will forever live in infamy. So, thanks for listening. That was West Between Wars, a tough chapter, really tough chapter. Hopefully that this lecture helped you. Have a great day, guys.